All right, we are live. Good evening, friends, and shalom, and blessings to you all in the name of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Welcome to this episode of Un-Apologetics, the show where we are unapologetic about apologetics, and I am your host, CJ Cox. I'm going to go ahead and adjust this camera just a little bit, make sure we got a little bit of a better view here. I really appreciate you guys being here today. We've got an incredibly exciting show for you today, yet again. By the grace of the Lord, we have had back-to-back, and in this case, literally, because we just had Godless Engineer on yesterday. But even if we're being a little bit less literal, back-to-back, in the sense of back-to-back episodes, right? Of really big interviews here. We've had, obviously Godless Engineer, like I said, David Roll. We have Pastor Phil Fox coming on in the future. And today we're going to be joined actually by Reasons to Believe's Dr. Hugh Ross. So we are far more blessed than we deserve here today, but nonetheless, I appreciate you guys being here. Before we get into the actual interview, of course, I want to drop a few of the channel housekeeping things for you guys. First things first, want to go ahead and let you know that we do have 2 more interviews planned in the future, as well as a debate coming up. So on this Sunday, we just recently set up a debate with Danny from Phil Talk. We're going to be debating whether or not the interpretation argument is valid. I, of course, would take the position that it is not, but he will be presenting the interpretation argument against God. So we'll be debating that this Sunday. We will have an episode where we'll interview Chris Date a week from today. We're going to be talking physicalism and dualism. That's not obviously a debate. It's going to be a lot like today, where we are coming from different positions, but we're just having a conversation. So, and that's that's the second actually conversation we've had with Chris Date. So some of you guys may have actually experienced him being here before. So that'll be fun. And then September the 2nd, we will be talking to Pastor Phil Fox on the question of being, or not the question, but basically the issue, if you will, I guess, of being Native American and Christian, right? So that's obviously going to be pretty fun. It's going to be hopefully illuminating for a lot of people. And I think it'll benefit a lot of people in ways that you might not expect. Like, for example, the necessity for people of all cultures to confront their culture. Something that I think is, we almost take for granted that we don't have to do as, quote, Westerners, right? But nonetheless, that'll obviously be a great conversation. And also more stuff that we don't have quite set in stone, but that we are looking to get started. So if you guys are interested in that sort of stuff, definitely hit that subscription, hit the notification bell to get notified every time we go live. Please do like and share this video and get it out to all the different social media platforms which you frequent. Of course, what good is a message without an audience to hear it? And without further ado, I want to go ahead and jump into our prayer so that we can get started with our interview today. So I appreciate you guys being here. If you'd like to join me, I'd certainly appreciate you doing so. And let's go ahead and get into this. Heavenly Father, I just want to thank you for the opportunities presented before us here today, Lord. We have, of course, just the opportunities of being Americans in the 21st century that we always want to give you thanks for, but also this channel, Lord, has been immensely blessed, Lord, with conversations that are just way out of our league, Lord Jesus, and I really appreciate it. And I pray that it is something that is used only for your glorification, Lord Jesus, not for the glorification of me or any of our guests here today or anybody in the audience, Lord, or any ideas, but just for the glorification of you and for brothers to come into unity as brothers and unity in Christ, Lord, while we also come to closer understanding of truth, Lord Jesus, knowing that you are truth. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's holy name, Lord. I give you the honor and glory, and I thank you again, Lord, in Jesus Christ's name. And Lord, I also want to pray, of course, there's just an anointing of the Holy Spirit here today on me, on Dr. Ross, and on the audience today, Lord Jesus, that we all just understand what it is that you want to communicate this day to us, Lord Jesus. I ask these things in Jesus Christ's holy name, and we give you the glory. Amen. All righty, my friends, we are joined by Dr. Hugh Ross. Shalom, my friend. How are you doing here today? I appreciate you being here today.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. So, now I highly doubt anybody is watching this show right now and not knowing who you are out of the two of us. But just in case, who is Dr. Hugh Ross, and why might we want to have a conversation with him?
Well, I'm an astrophysicist. I have a PhD from the University of Toronto, did research on quasars and galaxies for a number of years at Caltech. And while I was at Caltech, I was called to join the pastoral staff of a church that's sandwiched between Caltech and the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. We're also right next door to the headquarters of the Skeptic Society. So my role there for the past 4 decades has been training people in our church how to use the record of nature to bring people to the record, to the book of Scripture and into a relationship with Jesus Christ. And it was that church that 36 years ago helped me launch Reasons to Believe. So since that time, I've served as the president of Reasons to Believe. But I'm still on the staff of that church.
And that, of course, is awesome to hear. And you have very many popular debates and conversations, not only with younger creationists, but also just a litany of people.
Yeah, mainly with atheist scientists. I've had a lot of debates with atheist scientists.
Right. And so some of the ones that might be more familiar with my audience might be like, for example, your conversation with Dr. Jason Lyle. But some of those conversations that you've had with atheists might not be as popular around what we might term fundamentalist circles, quote unquote. So what are some of the conversations you've actually had with the atheist scientists as well, and not just dealing with in-house things, but also defending the faith out of the house?
Yeah, probably the ones that have gotten the most attention have been my debates with Louis Walpart. He's the former past chairman of the biology department at Imperial College in London, and also the vice president of the Humanist Society there in Britain. He's passed away, but the debate is still available online. And probably the one that's gotten the most attention is where I debated the British chemist, Peter Atkins. When I was an undergraduate, I had to study his textbooks on chemistry, but he's been a lifelong atheist. And if you just put my name in, Hugh Ross, Peter Atkins, it pops right up. I think it's gotten about 350,000 views. And a very interesting debate because he keeps insisting that our Christian faith has to be put to a scientific test. And what we've developed at Reasons to Believe is a testable, falsifiable, and predictive creation model. So it's a wonderful opportunity to challenge him with that and basically invite him to put his atheism to a scientific test. But you can watch that debate for free.
And that does lead me into my next question as well. So for those who may not be familiar, I'm sure everybody knows that you are an old earth creationist, but people might not know some of the actual details of the RTB model. So what is the creation model that you guys have at this point not only set up, but actually popularized? I would go as far as to say it's quite popular in the old earth community at this time. What is that model exactly? And what would be the specific details for lay people like ourselves to know?
The model goes back to 36 years when we first founded Reasons to Believe, basically saying if we're going to reach engineers and scientists who have not been exposed to the Christian faith, to the Christianity, we're going to have to do it through a testable scientific model and basically using the scientific method. And we approach our friends by saying, look, the scientific method comes from the pages of Scripture. It's no accident the scientific revolution exploded out of Reformation Europe. And so basically sharing with people who are not yet Christians, this has been the core of Christianity ever since the New Testament and Old Testament were put together. And so basically making the point that you see in Job and Psalms, the more we learn about nature, the more evidence we'll uncover for the supernatural handiwork of God. And so literally every day, we post new things on our website, scientific discoveries just recently published in the scientific literature that make a stronger case for the Christian faith. And I share with skeptics, hey, if you're not persuaded today, wait 1 week. In the course of the next week, there'll be new scientific discoveries that'll make an even stronger case for the Christian faith. But we also show ways that our Christianity can be falsified. I mean, if we can prove scientifically the universe did not have a beginning, that would be catastrophic to the Christian faith. If you can prove that we humans are no different than the animals, that would be catastrophic to the image of God that the Bible teaches. But we also say, hey, if we can prove those things, if we can establish that the universe really does have a beginning, that it concludes the beginning of space and time itself, that establishes the Christian faith. And likewise, if we can demonstrate that we humans are unique, human exceptionalism, this establishes the Christian faith. And historically, if we can demonstrate that the historical evidence is overwhelming, that Jesus Christ rose bodily from the dead, that establishes the Christian faith. So it works two ways. We can make a positive approach to prove the Christian faith, but also demonstrate to people who are not yet believers. You think we're wrong? Here's how to prove we're wrong. But if you can't prove we're wrong, then you're basically proving that we're right.
And so to get to some of the more specific details then, so the first question, of course, which would be the most obvious one, right, is how old is, number one, the universe, and number two, the earth, under the model that you would teach?
Yeah, from a biblical perspective, we take a day-age model. We believe that the creation days in Genesis 1 are literal days, but the Hebrew word yom that's translated as day has got four distinct literal definitions, one of which includes a long period of time. We do believe the days are consecutive. We believe there's no gaps between the days, and we believe they're non-overlapping. So we take the text very literally about what it says about what God did on each day. But yeah, it is a day-age perspective. And if you ask me, what is the age of the universe? It's 13.79 billion years old, give or take 0.04 billion. So it's measured quite precisely. And in the case of the Earth, that's measured even more accurately. It's 4.5662 billion years, plus or minus 0.0001 billion. And there's reasons why scientifically we can put such accurate dates, particularly on the age of the Earth, but also on the age of the universe. And as far as life goes, that would be 3.825 billion years ago when God created the first life on planet Earth. On the other hand, we believe that humanity is relatively recent. So I look at Genesis chapter 2, it describes God creating Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden and tells us that in the garden, 4 known rivers come together. And if you look at a map today, the only place where the Gihon, the Pishon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates come close together is in the southeast portion of the Persian Gulf, which today is more than 200 feet below sea level. But during the last ice age, it was above sea level. So in our model, God creates Adam and Eve sometime during the last ice age. And that's also compatible with what you see in Genesis 7 and 8 about Noah's flood. Because the text there tells us that it took almost 12 months for the flood waters to recede. And for it to take that long, there'd have to be huge quantities of melting snow and ice. But you would have that during the last ice age. And likewise, it's compatible with what you see in Genesis 10:25, where God divided the world in the days of Peleg. And we believe that's a reference to the Bering Land Bridge becoming the Bering Strait. And we now have a precise date for when that happened, 11,000 years ago. So it's a way of getting a rough date for when Noah's flood occurred. But also you get a rough date for when God created Adam and Eve. And what I find fascinating as a scientist, those rough biblical dates are actually more accurate than our best scientific dates. I mean, if you ask me as a scientist, what's the best scientific date we got for the origin of humanity? It's 150,000 years ago, plus or minus 150,000 years. Whereas from a biblical perspective, sometime during the last ice age, that puts you between 15 and 130,000 years ago.
And so, and that does get a couple of the other questions answered as well, such as you mentioned the beginning of life, as well as when exactly we would see humanity. One question that would immediately pop up, I think, in most of the audience's mind is, do you take the view that that is when humanity was specially created, or do you take the view that that is when humanity evolved from some ape-like ancestor?
Now, we do not take an evolutionary perspective at Reasons to Believe. So we believe that Adam and Eve were specially created by God and that the entire human species is descended from that one man and one woman. We also take the perspective that the bipedal primates that preceded Adam and Eve likewise had to be specially created, based on scientific studies that show that if you're dealing with a land mammal with an adult body size that's greater than 7 pounds, that mammal species will go extinct long before there's any opportunity to evolve. So anything bigger than 7 pounds, that's a special creation event, at least with respect to the mammalian species.
And I appreciate the clarification there. And then another question I know that would immediately come up would be when exactly would the flood be occurring? I assume probably towards the end of what we would consider today to be the Ice Age, so something around 10 to 12,000 years ago. But in your actual perspective, rather than my words and what I speculate, what would you say is the time of Noah's flood?
Well, we have an accurate date for when Abraham lived, somewhat accurate, roughly 4,000 years ago. We have the world being divided in the days of Peleg, so we got 11,000 year date for that. And with that, you can calibrate the Genesis 5 and 11 genealogies. But it doesn't give you a really accurate date for Noah's flood. It comes in around 40,000 plus or minus 30,000 years ago. So there's a big error bar. But after all, you're basing it on just 2 data points in the Genesis 11 genealogy. Where you can come up with a little more precise date is Genesis 10 and 11 talk about God scattering humanity over the whole face of the earth. And we have genetic data that tells us that humanity was in one locale. And it actually fits the biblical text because God commanded Adam and Eve, multiply and fill the earth. They didn't do it. They stayed in one place. And what you see in Genesis 11, God repeated that command to Noah and his children, multiply and fill the earth. But they didn't do it. They stayed in one place. And so what you see there in the early part of Genesis 11, God had to step in and forcibly scatter humanity over the whole face of the earth. If you look at Genesis 10, the table of nations, it describes in detail that spreading out of the different people groups based on the descendants of Noah. And genetically, we can establish that was occurring about 40 to 45,000 years ago. So if we take that evidence seriously, and it is backed up by carbon-14 dating, that would mean Noah's flood would have had to have happened somewhat previous to that event. But again, we're dealing with fairly significant error bars.
And then, and real briefly, by the way, I do just want to say 2 things. Number one, I will be taking audience questions, but not all of them, just because we don't have a lot of time. We don't have a super limited amount of time, but just not where this isn't going to be like a 3-hour one like our David Roll first one, right? So just to let you guys know. Secondly, I am hearing from at least one person that there is potentially audio issues on my part. Am I potentially too loud for anyone else? And if so, please let me know. I will be trying to fix that. But just would like to get a second or third opinion on that too, just to make sure that it is on our side. But at any rate, so next question that I know would be immediately on my audience's mind would be the scope of the flood. In the Reasons to Believe model, is the flood global, meaning all over the globe, or is it more localized to a certain area of the globe?
Yeah, that's defined in several places in the Bible. You got 2 Peter 2, 5, and 7, and 2 Peter 3, verses 5 and 6. What you see in 2 Peter 2, 5, and 7 is that the flood wiped out the world of ungodly people. That's verse 5. Verse 7 repeats the fact that it's the world of ungodly people. So as far as ungodly people lived, that's as far as the flood extended. And then what you see in 2 Peter 3, 5, and 6, it's cosmos tote. So you got the Greek word cosmos, translated world, but is qualified by the adjective tote, which means the world that existed at that time. And so what you got Peter doing is qualifying the distinction between the world of Noah and the world of Rome. In both cases, it's not the whole globe, but it's a different part. And so the question is, how far had humanity spread at that time? Well, based on Genesis 10 and 11, we know that humanity was not occupying Antarctica, wasn't occupying Greenland either, for that matter. And therefore, there'd be no need for God to flood Antarctica and Greenland. But the flood certainly extended everywhere where ungodly people lived, and extended everywhere where the soulish animals that were in relationship with those ungodly people also were wiped out. And that's something that's important when you read through Genesis 6, 7, and 8. It uses 6 different words for the animals that were impacted by the flood, but particularly the word basar is referring to the nephesh animals, the soulish animals, basically the birds and mammals that were in relationship, domesticated by these ungodly people. And what you see in the book of Leviticus, it's only these animals that are in a bonded relationship with wicked human beings that behave in a manner that's dangerous to other animals and humans. And you also see this in the book of Joshua and Judges, that when God was dealing with reprobate populations, the population had to be eliminated, and also all the animals that were associated with them. But that would mean, for example, there'd be no need for God to wipe out the polar bears or to wipe out the emperor penguins, because those animals would have had zero contact with these ungodly people. And since they're undamaged, there's no need for God to wipe them out. However, the model we have at Reasons to Believe has the flood taking place during the last ice age. So we're not just talking the inundation of Mesopotamia. We're talking the inundation of a region at least 4 times larger than that. The total inundation of the Persian Gulf, all of the Mesopotamian plain, large regions of Arabia and Persia were wiped out by this flood. We also argue the flood waters came from 4 different sources. The text tells us about torrential rain coming down from the sky. God took the aquifers and brought them up to the surface. So there was a huge upwelling of underground water. And then we argue, based on how long it took for the flood waters to recede, is that there had to be a heating event that was melting huge quantities of ice and snow on the surrounding mountains and basically sustaining the flood for a period of 13 and a half months. And there's geological evidence that there was a berm at the mouth of the Gulf of the Persian Gulf. And if that berm was broken by a tectonic event, that would cause a huge rush of Indian Ocean water to come through. And we argue that the combination of those 4 sources of water, there'd be 0 survivors outside the Ark of Noah. There's no way they could have run away from the flood. They would have been wiped out, and all the animals that are associated with them would have been wiped out.
And so, just to clarify just a quick, concise thing. So you do believe that the flood is universal in the sense that it would be all humanity and domesticated animals, but not global in the sense that a young Earth person would argue, in the sense that it's all over the globe, right?
Right. And if you want really specific biblical texts on that, you'll find them in Psalm 33, Psalm 104, Proverbs 8, and Job 38. Psalm 104, for example, is a creation psalm. Actually takes you through the content of all 6 creation days. And when it addresses creation day 3, in Psalm 104, verses 6, 7, and 8, it talks about how God transformed our planet from a water world where there's only water on the surface to where you now have water and continents coexisting. But what it tells us in verse 9, once the continents are in place, never again will water cover the whole face of the earth. And so just based on what you see in Psalm 104, the flood of Noah could not be global in extent. And I think what cinches that's repeated in Job 38, Proverbs 8, and Psalm 33. There's actually other texts too. So the wisdom books give you several sources that make it clear, because in referring to creation day 3, they're basically telling us these continental land masses are a permanent barrier to the waters that once covered the whole face of the earth. Another text you can go to would be chapter 8 of Genesis. Several years ago, I participated in a weekend-long debate with people who believed in a global flood. And it was on a Saturday, and 3 theologians that were young earth creationists and global flood proponents, they each spoke for an hour on why the flood, based on what you saw in Genesis 7 and 8, had to be global. And I was given 45 minutes to respond. But what they kept insisting in their 3 lectures is that the words you see for the earth in Genesis 7 and 8 are words like eres in the Hebrews, which could mean part of the earth, but they could also mean the whole earth. And they said there's actually Hebrew words like the word karabah that can never refer to the whole earth. And they said the fact that that word never appears in Genesis 7 and 8 proves that the flood is global. Well, it turns out they were mistaken. Karabah actually is used in Genesis chapter 8. So there you have that word used, which they themselves admit can never refer to the entire planet. It can only refer to part of the planet. And likewise, you have, I think their big praise was Genesis 7:19, where it says all the hills and mountains were covered by 15 cubits of water. But you get a similar phrase in Genesis 8:9, when God releases the dove. And just like it says in Genesis 7:19, there's water over the whole face of the earth. But it's in the context of the dove seeing nothing but water from one horizon to the other. Whereas what you see in Genesis 8:5, here's Noah on top of the ark, and he can see the distant hills. But the dove, verse 9, only water over the whole face of the earth. And so we need to look at texts like Genesis 7:19 in the context of the observer. And Genesis 7:19, Noah could only see water from one horizon to the other. All he saw was water. But obviously he wasn't seeing the Andes in South America.
And then so we got a excuse me, a couple, maybe a little bit less than I might actually want to ask, just a few more clarifying things, and then I want to move into a portion of challenging some of the points. But I do appreciate you allowing me to get everything fleshed out as to what it is that what it is that you teach and what it is that you believe is happening in the ancient world and all that, and also why, of course, why, right? Because that's just as important. So one that I know will immediately come up for a lot of people is things like not just dinosaurs, but you can wrap up the prehistoric animals in the phrase dinosaurs in a colloquial sense, right? Did those animals live with man at any point in time in your model?
I'm convinced they did not. I do think they're referred to implicitly in Psalm 104, because Psalm 104 basically talks about how God has packed our planet with as much life as possible, as diverse as possible, for as long as possible. And the largest land animal you can have today is the elephant. If it gets bigger than an elephant, the law of gravity will wind up causing that animal to go extinct, because an animal bigger and heavier than an elephant is going to injure itself unless you got water to provide buoyancy. And the eras of the dinosaurs were those where the continental land masses were covered by shallow seas. So where you got shallow seas, it's now possible to have a land animal that weighs 80 tons. It's not possible today, but with those shallow seas, you can have creatures that size. And so I don't know whether you ever watched the Jurassic Park series, but they completely violate the laws of physics. There's no way a T-Rex can run that fast without killing itself. And so T-Rex had the benefit of being able to walk around in water. And so the water provided the buoyancy that would prevent it, in spite of its size, from killing itself. I mean, on the earth today, you got the blue whale. The blue whale is way bigger than any dinosaur. But the reason why you can have an animal that size is because it lives in the ocean, where the ocean provides it with the buoyancy that it needs. And the last time Earth had these large shallow seas was 66 million years ago.
And then another question I know would be immediately also on a lot of people in my audience's mind, especially since we do have my brother Standing for Truth, by the way, Shalom, standing in the live chat. What's the deal with like Neanderthals and Homo habilis and Homo erectus and stuff like that on the reasons to believe model? Are they humans? Are they an advanced species of animal? You've already said you don't believe that we evolved, so that does rule out at least that option.
Yeah,
but
they're not humans. They're in the same category as orangutans and chimpanzees. Matter of fact, if you look at chimpanzees today, their tool use is about the same level of what you see for Neanderthals and Homo erectus and Homo habilis. But I think there's a good reason why God created these creatures. I mean, for example, when we look at Australia and North and South America, we see zero evidence for bipedal primates that preceded us human beings. But if you go to Africa, there's abundant evidence, at least 10 species, if not 12 species. And when you look at these species of bipedal primates, there's no linear evolutionary progression. The cranial size, the size of the brain, does not go up linearly. It goes up and down like this. The most recent bipedal primate that we can find, Homo florensis, had the smallest of the brains, only a quarter the size of a human brain. And likewise, bipedalism doesn't go up linearly. It goes up and down like this. The only thing where we see a linear progression is a capability of these different species being able to hunt large-bodied bird and mammal species. And so what we notice, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, the extinction rate of these animals when humans came into that area was only 4.5%. But when humans went into Australia, the extinction rate was above 94%. So in our model, it reasons to believe God creates these different species of these bipedal primates before he creates Adam and Eve, basically designed to train these large-bodied bird and mammal species. If you see big animals walking on two legs with weapons in their hands, run away. Keep in mind that the book of Job told us God designed these animals to come to us and to relate to us and serve and please us. That would work if we were not sinners. But because God knew we would sin, he knew we would abuse these animals and we would be in danger of wiping them out. And he also recognized, you see this in Job 38 and 39, these are the animals that are crucial for launching civilization. So we need cows, we need camels, we need horses, we need goats and sheep. But when humans went into Australia, they wiped all those animals out. And hence they never got out of their Stone Age subsistence. But because those animals didn't get wiped out in Africa and Europe and Asia, humans are able to launch and sustain civilization. So we think they too are objects of God's special creation, and that God specially created them to make sure that human civilization would be launched.
All right, I do have a bunch more questions, but because I want to move into the second portion, I'm only going to ask one more. It's of course the one that comes up every single time that the conversation between these two sides happens, and that is, when is death a factor in this model, and how exactly? Because of course that could mean various things depending on who exactly is answering the question, right? Whether we're talking about, well, yeah, and I'll just let you answer for yourself.
The two most explicit texts on that are Romans 5:12 to 19 and 1 Corinthians 15:20 to 22. And if you look at Romans 5:12, it says, as a result of Adam's sin in Eden, death through sin was visited upon all people. Well, there's only one species of life that has ever existed on earth that had the capability of sinning, and that's we human beings. And notice that the passage ends, death to all people. It does not say death to all life. And so Adam's sin, Adam's fall, brought death to the human species for the first time. Nowhere in the Bible does it say that there was no death of plants and animals or bacteria before humans sinned. And incidentally, we wouldn't be able to launch our civilization if it wasn't for 76 plus quadrillion tons of biodeposits in the crust of the earth. So we humans are the beneficiaries of bacteria, of algae, plants and animals dying for several billion years before God creates us. Because of that, we have this rich treasure chest of coal, oil, natural gas, concentrated metals, limestone, marble, gypsum, the list goes on. It literally exceeds 76 quadrillion tons.
All right, and I do appreciate that. And so now, just for the audience to know, and of course, obviously, for you as well. So now we're going to move on to the portion where I am going to do at least my best, right, to challenge some of the points from our perspective. And again, I do want to thank Dr. Ross for being patient with us here, and of course, answering all the questions so that we don't fall into the, ever so common pit hole that is straw man, right? So I appreciate that tremendously. So the first thing that is an immediate question from my perspective is basically the not necessarily the authority per se, because obviously authority of the Bible you can vary on the individual person, but you're not one who would make the claim that, like, for example, the Old Testament events didn't actually occur, right? Or that they're allegorical or something. So that wouldn't be something I would apply to you. Right. But there is still the question of its ability to communicate, I think. And one of the places that I think this is evident is the chronologies, for example. We have, like, such and such begat so-and-so after so many years, and it goes on and on until we get to Abraham. And it seems that if we take everything at face value, there does appear to be, give or take, we have to add a year or subtract a year for things like generational slip. And then also there's a little bit of ambiguity as far as Terah to Abraham, but give or take something between 50 and 100 years. It does appear that we can count that back from Babylon all the way to the flood, and even all the way to Abraham or to Adam, if we take the previous chronologies into account. So the long and short of the question is, why is it that we aren't able to take that as at face value? I
think you can take it to get a crude date, like I suggested. The fact that we do have a good historical date for Abraham. We got a carbon-14 date for the forming of the Bering Strait. So you got a couple of data points there. But one thing I've noticed that young Earth theologians and old Earth theologians agree on is that the genealogies in Genesis 5 and 11, like all the biblical genealogies, are incomplete. And so the debate is over, well, how complete are they? And so many of my young Earth creationist friends will say, well, we think 10,000 years back to Adam will work. But I've run into other young Earth creationists that say we can push it back to 50,000. And so the whole point is, well, how many gaps are you going to allow in the Genesis 5 and 11 genealogy? Clearly, you got to have at least one, because there's an 11th name mentioned in Luke that you don't see in Genesis 5. And people are well aware, based on the biblical Hebrew, that the word for son can equally mean grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson. Likewise, the word father can mean great father, or grandfather, or great-grandfather. I mean, you've got the passage in the book of Daniel where Belshazzar refers to Nebuchadnezzar as his father, and yet they're not even blood related. but there are 4 generations between them. And so there is acknowledged, you don't come up with a 4004 BC of Archbishop Usher. He got that date by assuming that the genealogies were exhaustively complete. But I don't know of any doctoral level theologian who holds that position today, whether they be young earth or old earth. But I do agree that you can't push the date back to 1,000,000 years ago. There's a limit to how much you can stretch those genealogies. So you basically wind up with what I said before, somewhere in the neighborhood of, say, 130,000 to 15,000 years ago fits. I frankly think you get a better date based on what you see in Genesis 2 than what you get from the biblical genealogies. And if you want to read a very thorough discussion on that, a couple of theologians wrote an article at reasons.org on Genesis 5 and 11, and there they get into all the exegetical details.
I appreciate that. And so one thing that I would want to, I guess, kind of push on a little bit there is I could even grant, and in fact, I almost think that not only could you grant, but you probably would want to grant that there is some incompleteness in the chronologies, just simply because it does appear that the Jews frequently do that. For example, Matthew keeps his generations in sets of 14, right?
Right.
Right. But the thing that I see in particularly in these, and it's not unique to Genesis, but it is unique to father-son relationships, is the phrase so-and-so begat so-and-so, which seems to imply the direct lineage of the second person from the first person. And the reason I find that to be important in this instance is because it does appear to me that creates a chain of what would be literal numbers, even if they are literal numbers that we might have to account for some lag in, such as generational slip or the fact that they have lunar years. What would you say to a response like that?
Well, I definitely agree there's a chain there, but to claim there's an unbroken chain is reading more into the Hebrew than is there. And I think the problem is you're looking at the English translation. And as you're probably aware, biblical Hebrew is a very small vocabulary, only 3,000 words if you don't count the names of people and cities. And now you're translating into an enormous vocabulary language. Last time I checked, the English language was beyond 4 million words. And, even just to carry on a conversation, you have to have a vocabulary in English of over 100,000 words. And so just realizing what we think is an unbroken link from father-son really isn't the case. It could be a father to a great-great-grandson. It could be beginning a line that ends in so-and-so. And again, this is not disputed amongst old earth and young earth theologians. Both sides recognize that that is the case. As I said before, the debate is, well, how much room can you allow? And I do concede the point that you can't do what theistic evolutionists do and try to cram millions of years back to, say, the first Homo erectus creature. I don't think the text permits that. But a few tens of thousands of years, that's certainly within the realm of what you see there. And also, I think we need to realize every genealogy in the Bible is incomplete, but every genealogy is preaching a theological message. And the question I've asked myself, what is a theological message of Genesis 5 and Genesis 11? You made the point that what you see in Matthew is 3 14s. What you see in Genesis 5 and 11 are 2 sets of 10. So it's picking out 10 in Genesis 5 and another 10 in Genesis 11. And what is so important about those sets of 10? And I've often wondered, is it simply listing the few patriarchs that died a natural death, or like Enoch were taken to heaven by God? Because what you see in Genesis 6 is that humanity had degraded to a point where every man and woman, all they could think about was how to do physical harm to their fellow humanity. And what I've done in this book, Navigating Genesis, is to say, look, I think there's sound biblical and scientific evidence that people living the days before the flood really did have the capacity to live 800 or 900 years. And if they had that capacity, they'd be having a lot of children. In fact, you see that in Genesis 5. It says that Eve had many children besides Cain, Abel, and Seth, both sons and daughters. Well, if they had the capacity to live past 900 years and were reproductive for, say, 2/3 of their lifespan, and the best birth control method they had was the rhythm method without the benefit of thermometers, you're looking at a minimum of 150 children per couple. And so I actually calculate that when God said to Adam, multiply and fill the earth, if it wasn't for the sin of murder, there would have been 17 billion people on the face of the planet 150 years before Adam died. The reason that didn't happen, murder got completely out of control. In fact, I argue that the average lifespan in the days before the flood was shorter than the average lifespan we have today. 95% of the human species was having their lives terminated, not by a natural death, but by being murdered by their fellow man. And so I'm wondering, what we see recorded in Genesis 5 and 11 are the few individuals, the few male individuals that were not murdered by their fellow man. They actually got to live their full life of 700, 800, 900, 969 years. And I kind of support that by the fact when you go throughout the rest of the Old Testament, every single genealogy, there's a sermon that's being preached. And so I get excited about the genealogies. I don't skip over them. I look for the sermon message.
And to sort of wrap up on this particular point, just so we can move on to another one, I would just want to ask: Do we have a area in Scripture or in contemporary Jewish literature? Really, even it doesn't. I think we can use contemporary loosely. Like, for example, if we can find something like this in the Talmud, I know it's not necessarily contemporary, but it's close enough, I think. Do we have anything in those places where phraseology like so-and-so begat so-and-so refers to like grandfathers and things like that? Because I do know that we have, like, for example, you pointed out Belteshazzar will refer to Nebuchadnezzar as his father, or Jesus is called son of David. But do we ever see the phrase, like, for example, and David begot Josiah, even though Josiah is a descendant of David and not actually his birth son? Do we ever see something like that in the Bible or in contemporary Jewish literature?
Well, you mentioned the text. We actually do. Jesus said that he was descended from David. Josiah said he was descended from David. And there's nothing in the text that tells you exactly how many generations were there. Where there's one place where you might be able to make some headway that way is, remember the people wanted a king?
Right.
They made Saul the king. They did not make Jesse the king. And a number of Bible scholars have pointed out, well, wait a minute, David is ultimately descended from Tamar. And, there was an illicit relationship between Judah and Tamar. And the Levitical law tells us that in terms of someone taking the throne as a king, there had to be at least 10 generations from that kind of illicit relationship to where a person come. And David was the 10th generation. His father was a 9th generation. And so that's why Saul was made king, because they couldn't select somebody from the tribe of Judah. There hadn't been the 10 generations that gone by yet. But however, when you look at that text, it's not like what you see in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11. You asked me the question, do we see anything like that in the Talmud? I don't know of anything in Jewish literature. The commentaries I've read, what you see in Genesis 5 and 11, it's unique to Genesis 5 and 11. There are no other examples we can point to.
Well, and I actually do appreciate that, because I'm sure that is probably something that, shall we say, people of lesser courage might want to leave out, right? Because it is something that's a little bit of like a little nick. So I appreciate that. But so to move on to that, because I do I want to ask a few other questions as well. One thing that I think is important with Neanderthal, and also, as it turns out, Denisovian, although I am personally not, I'm not really into anthropology. I'm just really into the idea of cavemen. So I like Neanderthals, and I've been interested in Neanderthals, but I don't know anything about the rest of them. I'll admit that freely. But it does appear, I guess, we're also related to Denisovans. And so the question, I guess, would be if we were to expect that, for example, Neanderthals and Denisovans were more animalistic than they were humanistic. And of course, we're excluding the possibility of evolution, which I would even agree on, of course. How would something like that be possible? Like how is it that we could have Homo sapiens mating with Homo neanderthalis, as they are called today?
Well, just to be clear, there isn't compelling evidence that that actually happened. I do admit that there is genetic evidence that suggests that modern humans did interbreed with Neanderthals and Denisovans. But if you actually read the scientific paper, they make it clear that the incidence of sexual contact between humans, Neanderthals, and Denisovans was extremely slight because the genetic signal is incredibly weak. In fact, the 11 authors who wrote the paper made the point that it's so rare, it's rarer than the level of bestiality that takes place between humans and chimpanzees today. So we're talking a very low level, and basically making the point that it's at such a low level that if it did happen, it would have no impact on damaging the image of God in human beings. However, it's quite possible that the similarities we see in the DNA of Neanderthals and what we see in Europeans is simply due to the fact that they lived in the same geographical area and were subject to the same geographical or environmental pressures. So there's some evidence that Neanderthals may have had red hair and fair skin. Well, that's also true of Europeans. And so I'm basically making the point. I think you could go either way with this theologically, because what I see in Genesis chapter 3, you've got Satan trying to damage the image of God. And what better way from Satan's perspective to damage the image of God than to encourage humans to engage in bestiality? And this is why, for example, you look at the book of Leviticus, the strongest prohibition you see in the book of Leviticus is basically against bestiality. And so it tells me God's trying to protect the image of God. But I also see Satan trying to attack the image of God. So I don't think it's beyond theological reasonableness that there was some sexual intercourse going on between humans and Neanderthals, just like there's some going on between humans and the great apes today. But it was such a low level, it had no impact on any way damaging the image of God. God made sure that it wasn't wholesale. And incidentally, there's growing evidence that humans really didn't have contact with Neanderthals. We now know that the population, maximum population of Neanderthals was below 15,000. So, and they were living there in Europe and then in Western Asia, and that the date for the last Neanderthal is the same date for the first human. And given that, it's quite possible they never had contact with one another. So scientifically, it's an open question. Theologically, I could go either way. I don't see the Bible contradicting either hypothesis, but it is an hypothesis.
And so one thing that I would want to ask on that is, so have you ever by chance seen, have been to the museum in Hill City, South Dakota? It's a small one, but it does have the largest complete mosasaur skeleton. So it is somewhat of a claim to fame.
The largest what?
Complete mosasaur.
Oh, you're talking about a dinosaur, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's not what I'm referencing in particular, but that's the claim to fame. So if you had ever been there, it would probably be because of something like that. But have you ever been to the Hill City, South Dakota Dinosaur Museum?
No, I haven't, but I've been to one in Alberta, which is the world's largest findings of dinosaurs. They got an enormous museum there, and you can actually walk through the area where they're coming up with fresh digs. I mean, it's enormous what they've been able to find there. And not just dinosaurs, they're actually finding creatures that date back to the Cambrian era as well.
So, and they might even have the same thing there as what they have at Hill City. So perhaps that might even be the area might be, I guess, irrelevant in the sense that you might have still seen it. But so at Hill City, they have a Neanderthal skull, and they actually have like a lineup, right? So you have like your chimpanzee skull and Australopithecine skull, and I don't know if they did this on purpose, but side by side there is the skull of a Neanderthal on one side, a Australian Aborigine on the other, and then on the what would be from your perspective the left side of the Aborigine, a Caucasian skull. So you have a Caucasian, an Aborigine, and the Neanderthal. And the interesting thing looking at them, and again, I don't know if they did this on purpose or not, but is the Neanderthal skull and the Aborigine skull are almost indistinguishable from each other outside of the title. In other words, the Aborigine has heavy brow, high cheekbone, large mouth here that appears like it could have the wisdom teeth and stuff like that. The long and short of my question there would be, why is that the case? Because from the, I guess, the younger perspective, it would appear to be is Aborigines had what you would consider like a Stone Age culture. So Neanderthals might just be humans with a Stone Age culture, and therefore have facial features that might, as well as other features that might be as a result of adapting to that kind of lifestyle. But obviously, you would probably take a different view than that, right?
Yeah, you need to look at the skull structure, because what you see with Neanderthals is that they had a brain size roughly equivalent to human beings. However, it was supporting a much larger body. So we humans had a much higher encephalation ratio, which is the weight of our brain to the average weight of our bodies. So that's where we're quite a bit ahead of the Neanderthals. But another part is, if you look at the Neanderthal skull, the Neanderthals had a small parietal lobe, whereas humans have an enormous parietal lobe. And it's that parietal lobe that allows us to engage in philosophy, mathematics, symbolic communication, the development of literature. And that's something that Neanderthals did not have. And we look at the Neanderthal artifacts, we see no evidence that they had symbolic capability. You look at the Aborigines, yeah, they had symbolic capability at the same level that the rest of humanity does. They're radically distinct from the Neanderthals. And so you actually need to look at the shape of the brain. What's interesting is that the animal that comes the closest to having the same cranial structure as humans are ravens and crows, not the great apes, not the Neanderthals or Homo habilis or Homo erectus. It's ravens and crows. And so they have the same three compartmental brain structure that we humans do. The big difference, of course, is they don't have as many neurons as we have. I mean, their neurons are packed into a much smaller package. But it's something we've also been able to observe. The smartest non-human animal is not the chimpanzee. There are many bird species that far outstrip the great apes in terms of intellectual capability. So, for
Actually,
example,
I know too. Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I just wanted to
yeah, go
briefly say I
ahead.
know that there's been some recent studies that suggest actually wolves and shepherd dogs like border collies might actually have equal, if not greater, intelligence to chimpanzees, and that's very recent studies. But just to say, I know what you're talking about, right? That there are animals that appear to be more intelligent than apes, and they're not even.
Well, it's a powerful argument against evolution. It was Charles Darwin who said the animals that look most like us will also be most like us intellectually. And he basically challenged people to prove him wrong. Nobody did experiments until the early 2000s. And the first paper I saw published that actually did some comparisons, the paper was titled Darwin's Mistake. The great apes are not the ones that most closely match us intellectually. But the fact that they don't is catastrophic to Darwinian evolution. It's catastrophic to all naturalistic models of evolution.
And then, so last question on the Neanderthal question would be: there have been a couple people, both YEC and evolutionist, which I know it's interesting to see them on the same side in this regard. But at least in this one thing, they do agree in hypothesizing essentially religion. And the basis for this, if I'm not mistaken, is that Neanderthals appear to bury their dead, not that they appear to have like shrines or things like that. I don't think anybody's found a Neanderthal shrine, but I guess the question would just be simply that: do Neanderthal bury their dead? And if so, why would an animal species potentially do that, if not something religious?
Yeah, we're aware of those research papers, but they're highly subjective. It's based on the fact that they'll find Neanderthal bones, and about 10 or 20 feet away, they see evidence for flower pollen. And basically, they're hypothesizing that the Neanderthals buried their dead and had a ceremony where they were throwing flowers over the grave. Well, that's highly subjective. It's simply based on the fact that we find, flower pollen in reasonable vicinity to these buried bones. And we have no idea how the burial took place. The idea that it was a purposeful burial. We don't see a headstone. There's nothing like what you see in a graveyard that humans have, nothing like that. And the fact that we see no symbolic capability at any time during the existence of Neanderthals, the fact that we don't see advanced inner tool use. I mean, they were around for 200,000 years, and yet their technology at the end of those 200,000 is the same as at the beginning. And that's true of all the bipedal primates that preceded us. We do not see technological advance. Whereas the moment humans show up, there's an explosion in technological advance. Early humans were planting grains, harvesting the grains, grinding the grains, roasting them, and turning them into bakery products. This goes back to the earliest finds we have of humans. We see nothing like that with the bipedal primates that preceded us. And in terms of the weapons, it was either a rock or a piece of wood. With humans, you immediately have bows and arrows, and you have axes. So complex tools show up very quickly.
And then, so the last thing I want to, because chronologies and things of surrounding Neanderthals are incredibly important, and there's a whole bunch of different ways we could go with some other questions too, like language about the flood, or talking about dinosaurs, and so many other things. But unfortunately, we don't have an infinite amount of time quite yet. It's someday, but
new
not quite this
we
day.
will.
Yeah, exactly. But so the last thing I will want to challenge then, instead of going on the whole litany, would be then the death instance. Now, admittedly, I take a somewhat even controversial view amongst YEC. We all, meaning the YEC, agree that there is no animal death before sin. But I take it a step farther and say that I think the Bible portrays animal death as evil, not equivalent to human death, but certainly what we would consider to be actually even sinful or cursed or something along those lines. Now, the very first question I would want to ask, just because I know somebody has already asked it and they probably didn't ask it in quite the same way that I would want to ask it. It might be a little bit more, shall we say, provocative. So to ask it in a less provocative way, if animals can die in paradise, such as the Garden of Eden, would they also be dying in heaven as well?
Well, when we get to the new creation, we're dealing with a realm where there's different laws of physics and different dimensions. And so I read Revelation 21 and 22. It's a realm where there's no thermodynamics. There's no gravity. There's no electromagnetism. And it's completely different dimensions. And it tells us nothing dies, nothing decays. Well, if you don't have entropy, nothing's going to die or decay. But what you see in the Bible is the explicit statement repeated many times. The laws of physics are constant. But you see in Jeremiah 33, God challenges the Jews and say, you change your mind all the time, but I'm a God that's immutable. I never change. As proof, look to the laws that govern the heavens and the earth. As they don't change, I don't change. And you got other passages, Romans 8, you got Genesis 3, all stating that stars were shining, for example, before the fall of Adam and after the fall. And that wouldn't happen if the laws of physics, uh, unless they were indeed unchanging. And as an astronomer, I can tell you, we can look at distant stars and galaxies and measure the laws of physics. They're exactly the same as what we measure in the lab. And we can go all the way back to the very beginning of the universe and see those same laws of physics. And so, given that the laws of physics have not changed, and according to Romans 8, they will not change until the full number of humans that God intends to redeem are in fact redeemed, then indeed we got bacteria, we got fungi, we got plants, algae, insects, flies. They're all dying before the fall of Adam because they're all subject to these laws of physics. And incidentally, there are biblical texts that talk about how flies were dying. So, and I don't see anywhere in the Bible where it tells us that that's evil. Where it does tell us it's evil is when we humans are responsible for the death of these animals. But in terms, I mean, you got passages in Job, for example, and the Psalms that talk about how God shows his love to the lion and the raven in providing prey for the lion and the raven. So it tells us that predatory activity was part of God's creation. And if you're a biologist, you realize that the death rate of the herbivores skyrockets. Their suffering skyrockets if you take away the carnivores. The carnivores are crucial to minimize the suffering and the death of the herbivores. And there's many field experiments that have demonstrated that over the last 2 centuries. And so, and frankly, I find this only to be a debate when people live in cities. When you live in cities and are cut off from the natural world, often you fail to see the benefits of the balance of life, of having detrivores, herbivores, and carnivores, and parasites all coexisting with one another. They coexist in an optimal way. I also see that as a huge argument against evolution. Whenever you see a mass speciation event, and that's referred to in Psalm 104, verses 29 and 30, how God recreates. But on the fossil record, every time we see a mass speciation event, the predator-prey relationships are immediately optimized. There's no time delay. They're there right away. And that would never happen without the intervention of a supernatural, super intelligent creator.
So there's a couple things I would want to, and obviously we want to take it one by one so I don't just pile a whole bunch on you, right? Because that's not fair. So the first question I would want to ask is in regards to, so you brought up how God does give, he provides for the lion and so on by providing them prey. And I do think that that is an interesting point, but I also notice the Bible does say, like, for example, God delivers the Canaanites into Joshua's hands. But certainly from a biblical perspective, war and indiscriminate slaughter are not good things. But in these situations, they were things that became good in effect by having to be done, right? So, for example, in the case of the Canaanites, they needed to be judged. Would that throw a monkey wrench in the idea for you, or maybe even just give you cause to question, or am I just going the wrong direction with this?
No, I kind of see it as God's merciful hand. It's like a doctor coming to you and saying, you got stage 4 cancer. And if I don't take that tumor out of your stomach, you're going to die. And so you say, okay, perform surgery on me. The surgery is not pleasant. And every time you get cut up, it's bad. But the doctor is basically saying, I'm going to remove this malignancy to save your life. Likewise in the Old Testament, not the New Testament, but the Old Testament, we have what I call societal reprobation. A good example is Sodom and Gomorrah, and where we see that every man, young and old, came to Lot's door to homosexually rape his two guests. And so basically the angels there were realizing the entire city is reprobate. There's no one here that's righteous except Lot and his family. And so they were rescued, and he wiped out the whole city of the Sodomites and also the other 4 cities of the plain. I look at the flood as the same way. At that time, everybody except Noah and his family had become completely reprobate. And reprobation is where people are not only evil, they're committed to be evangelists for evil, to get as many other people involved in their evil as they can. And so it's like a stage 4 cancer. It's going to grow out of control unless God performs surgery. But this raises the question, why is God not doing that today? Well, when Jesus came, he told his disciples, when I rise from the dead, you will become the salt of the earth. The Holy Spirit will come upon you and permanently indwell you. And that permanent indwelling is going to make you a preservative. And that preservative will prevent societal reprobation. And I find it interesting that when you read history, there's not been a single example of societal reprobation since the day of Pentecost, recorded in Acts chapter 2. Whereas previous to that, there are many examples of societal reprobation. But wherever societal reprobation occurred, God performed surgery. And so you see this interesting discussion between God and Abraham, where Abraham says, well, okay, I see why you're going to have to do what you're going to do with Sodom and Gomorrah. But he says, look at all these wicked Amorites up in the hills with me. And God gave the interesting response. He told Abraham, their wickedness has not yet reached its fullness. I will not touch them. But 400 years from now, they will become completely reprobate, and then I'll deal with them. So again, it kind of lays out the standard. When the reprobation becomes societal, God performs surgery. And that surgery is an act of love and mercy. He hasn't had to do it in New Testament times because the salt of the earth has been here ever since the day of Pentecost.
A related question on the animal death thing is, so we see throughout the Old Testament, that there is this link with, so for example, you have the sacrifices, right? And the animal is killed, and it's killed as a result of the human sin, right? The implication seemingly being that, number one, that the animal dies because of your sin, but also number two, that the result of sin is the thing that leads to animal death, rather, is a negative, something that shouldn't be here in the beginning. In other words, it appears to be saying that not only is it your sin that causes the death itself, but also the death itself is now linked almost at the hip with this idea of evil and unnecessary waste of life, I guess, to put it.
Yeah, my response to that is it's linked to human evil. The book of Hebrews makes it very clear that the animal sacrifice of the Old Testament was a tool that God was using to show, hey, the Messiah is coming. And, you sacrifice these animals every year. It does not remove sin. And basically making the point, this animal sacrifice is a teaching tool to tell you there's one who will come. And if you put your trust in the one who will come, you will be saved. And you actually see that in the book of Job. I mean, Job was a patriarch. This is before the priesthood. And so he was doing the animal sacrifices. But you also see in Job 19 that Job recognized that these animal sacrifices did not deliver him from sin. It was simply a symbol. And he recognized that he had to put his trust and confidence in the advocate redeemer. That's the title he gave to him, the advocate redeemer. He declares that the advocate redeemer is God himself. And he declares, because I'm putting my trust in that and not in these animal sacrifices, which is merely a symbol of what God will do, then I know God will honor my commitment and I will be saved. And so he actually declared the assurance of salvation long before Jesus Christ came and sacrificed himself on the cross.
So would you say, because when we have this, right, so like to compare it to Jesus's sacrifice, right? The sacrifice of Jesus has the quality not only of only existing because human beings are sinful. In other words, if human beings were not sinful, Jesus would not have to be crucified, right?
Right.
But also of being something that is negative as a result. In other words, bad things happen, therefore this occurs. And I know it's almost like a razor's edge as to why those are even different. But the point being that you have the first claim being that this is the cause of such an occurrence, namely Jesus's death.
Well, I think
And
the symbolism there is, notice it was an innocent animal that was sacrificed. And basically making the point, it's going to have to be someone that is innocent, but also has the power to save. The Hebrews is very clear. The sacrifices had no capacity to deliver people from their sins. It was simply a symbol of that which would. But part of the symbolism was, notice someone innocent must die. And and you had to do these animal sacrifices over and over again. And so the people got the point. Hey, the animals aren't going to do it, but God has promised that he will do it. And so, and you got Moses in Deuteronomy trying to explain this to the Jews, basically saying, a lot of you think that the animal sacrifices are going to save you. They won't.
right.
The one that will is the one that will come after me, the one for whom everything he does will be morally perfect, and the one for whom everything he says you must obey. He's the one that's going to deliver you. And basically, he was making the point, do not look back on the law. Do not look back on these animal sacrifices. Look forward to what the one true God will do to deliver you from your sin. He's going to come. He's going to be completely innocent, and he will permanently deliver you from your sin. If you put your confidence in that, you'll be saved. If you put your confidence in trying to keep the law, you'll be condemned. He basically said in 2 sermons in the book of Deuteronomy, you think you can do it? You're fooling yourselves. No one can do it. I can't do it. There's only one that can, and he's going to come.
The last question I would have, and this will be the last question for me entirely, because we are now 17 minutes over the hour. So I appreciate your time tremendously, and we'll. I know there's just so much to talk about on this, right? So I have to pick and choose, right? But I appreciate you. How would you respond to the young Earth interpretation of a verse like Genesis 9:2, which seems to suggest that humanity was actually not allowed even to eat meat, let alone actually doing it before the flood, and that they're only given the opportunity to do so after the flood, even going as far as to say, as the herb I gave to you, so now is the beast. What would be the, I guess, just reasons to believe interpretation of that verse?
Oh, we got a whole chapter on that in this book, Navigating Genesis. And basically making the point, God says, you can eat meat because you're not going to live long enough for it to make any difference. If you're going to live to be 800, 900 years, you better avoid eating meat, because the eating of meat is going to concentrate heavy metals in your body at a rate 10,000 times greater than if all you do is eat vegetables. But he says, hey, your maximum lifespan is now going to be 120 years. So you can eat meat because it's not going to make any significant difference. I might caution people today in the 21st century, you might want to avoid certain kinds of heavily mercury polluted fish, like swordfish. Other than that, you can eat what you want because you're not going to live long enough for it to make any difference. And by the way, I think that's the chapter we're giving away for free. Reasons.org/Ross, you can get that chapter on the new scientific evidence that people living before the flood really could live 800 or 900 years. Today, because of our radiation environment, it's impossible for us to live that long. In the days before the flood, humanity was exposed to exponentially less radiation than we are today. I believe people really did live that long. And given that they were living that long, they would have to be on a vegetarian diet.
And I do appreciate the answer there. And so to clarify first, because I don't want to be bothersome on you at all. Do you have time for some audience questions as well?
I'll take a couple of minutes. I got time. Go for it.
For sure. So I won't ask all of them, of course, because we want to, like I said, not waste any time here. So the first one that I want to ask here, because I think it's just a good thing to look at the growth of theories and things like that. Man asks, what are some of the adjustments from your earliest books, like Beyond the Cosmos, until today? In other words, what are some things that have evolved in the model that would have been maybe believed 36 years ago, but now you perhaps have changed the view on?
Well, I've gone through 3 different editions of this book. It used to be called The Genesis Question. It's now called Navigating Genesis. My book, The Creator and the Cosmos, is in a 4th edition. And the reason we keep bringing out these new editions is we realize that with advancing theological research and scientific research, we can make a much stronger case for a Christian faith today than we could 35 years ago. And I actually encourage people, save the old editions, because it's a great way to share with non-Christians. Look at how much stronger our case has become over the course of 30 years. Compare the 1st edition to the 2nd edition to the 3rd edition and the 4th edition, and you see how much. That's especially the case in The Creator and the Cosmos. The evidence gets exponentially greater with every new edition we bring out. I mean, I have a weekly blog called Today's New Reason to Believe, where I basically take a scientific research paper and show how this significantly strengthens the scientific case for the Christian faith. That's kind of where we're putting in our books. But if you were to ask me, is there anything that we backed away from? Well, I remember the very first time I brought out a booklet called Genesis 1: A Scientific Perspective. This goes back to 1973, when I was sharing my faith with professors at Caltech. And I talked about how we didn't know, the Bible talks about the sun, moon, and stars on Creation Day 4. Back in 1973, we did not have any theory on the formation of the moon that fit within the laws of physics. So I said, this is a hint that there might be something supernatural going on. That's all I said. What I'm now saying in The Creator and the Cosmos is we do have a detailed model for the formation of the moon. And it's all understood in the context of the laws of physics, but it's so extremely improbable. Basically, you've got the proto-Earth and a 5th rocky planet, Theia, merging together at a low velocity collision at a precise angle where the Earth is rotating about every 2.5 hours per day. And if you have that all set up just right, you get a bigger Earth and you get the moon with the exact features that it has. But the level of fine-tuning design that's necessary to pull that off is so extreme that an atheist lunar scientist said in the British journal Nature, all this fine-tuning is giving us philosophical disquiet. I mean, it's really disturbing as atheism. All this design you need to make it work. So I'm of the opinion that, hey, what I said back in 1973 is true. There indeed is something miraculous. But what I said back there is no possibility that we can explain this within the context of the laws of physics. Today there is. And it's because of the remarkable advances we've been making with computer simulations that we've been able to figure this all out. However, the degree of intricacy and fine tuning, I still stand by my statement. It's a miracle.
Next question we have is, why should we, and I'm condensing the question because it's quite long, but why should we assume the measurement of time hasn't changed? In other words, why should we assume that today's day is the same as the day, for example, a couple million years ago?
Well, that's a good question. And there's a biblical answer and a scientific answer. The biblical answer is there's multiple passages in the Bible that tell us the laws of physics do not change. They're fixed. They're constant. And if that's the case, the clocks back then are running at the same rate they are now. There is no change in the rate in which clocks run. With one important caveat, special relativity tells us the faster you're moving away from Earth, the slower the clock will run. And so, as you know, given an expanding universe, that means when we look at supernova eruptions in a galaxy that's billions of light years away, because it's moving away from us at a significant fraction of the velocity of light, the clock will be slower. And indeed, when we look at the supernova eruption in galaxies that far away, we see that the eruption cycle takes about 10 or 11 months, whereas in our galaxy, it's just 7 months. So we actually do see the slowing down of time in direct proportion to the velocity that the galaxy is moving away from us. And in astronomy, too, we can look far away and hence far back in time and measure the laws of physics. The laws of physics are identical to what we measure in the lab today. And so as an astronomer, I can tell you, our measurements prove the biblical point. There has been no change in the laws of physics.
Next question we have, a little bit of a less heady one, but still one that's interesting nonetheless. How many Ice Age cycles would we have in the Reasons to Believe model? Obviously, in the Young Earth model, there's only a single one. In the RTB model, how many Ice Age cycles would we go through over the course of Earth's history?
Well, ever since 2.58 million years ago, we've been in an Ice Age cycle. But for most of that time, the cycle's been 41,000 years, driven by the changing tilt on Earth's rotation axis. Our rotation axis goes through a cycle every 41,000 years. And when it tilts down, the planet warms up. When it tilts up, the planet cools down. And so that was the primary driver of most of the Ice Age cycle period. But the last 8 cycles, the period has been about 100,000 years. And as you look at the orbit of the Earth about the sun, the shape of that orbit changes with a period of about 100,000 years. So that seems to be the dominant factor affecting the Ice Age cycle in the last 800,000 years. Although, as I've written in my book, Weathering Climate Change, there's actually 15 independent factors that are responsible for changing the Ice Age cycle from a 41,000 year periodicity to 100,000. But if you want to have human civilization, you want the 100,000, not the 41,000. With 41,000, your warm interglacials are only going to last 2,000 or 3,000 years. With 100,000 years, you can get it lasting 10, 12,000 years. And that's what we notice. We've been in a warm interglacial for the last 10,500 years.
And then last question, which I've saved for last because I think it's probably the funnest, for lack of a better term. Questioner basically says, I'm curious if Hugh Ross has ever addressed the Nephilim / son of gods. In other words, what do you believe those are? I know that's not necessarily related to old Earth versus young Earth,
right.
But it's sort of a fun one, so to speak, right?
Well, it is a fun one, and you'll find a whole chapter on it in this book, plus an appendix. So we actually deal with that question, mainly because we think it's relevant to what you see in Genesis 1 to 11. Where it says the sons of God came to the daughters of men, and they gave birth to the Nephilim. and God wiped the Nephilim out with a flood, but it says the sons of God came after the flood, and there was a new generation of Nephilim. And I basically say in my chapter here, there's only 2 Nephilim in the Bible where it tells us how big they are, but they're big. Goliath, if you use a short cubit, was 9 feet 9 inches tall. And it tells us that he went into battle with at least 250 pounds of weapons and armor. And likewise, we got Og, the king of Bashan, and it said the bed he slept on was made out of iron, and it was at least 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. So these are big creatures. But the other thing we notice in the Old Testament, we only see male Nephilim. There's no mention of female Nephilim. It also tells us that they had birth defects, 6 fingers and 6 toes. And we were told that they're evil. And so evidently they were so evil and so physically powerful that God sought to wipe them out. He first wiped them out with a flood, and then he used David's mighty men to wipe out the last of the Nephilim during the reign of King David. And there's multiple explanations as to what these Nephilim are all about. I do make the point that based on their height and the amount of weight of weapons and armor they took into battle, there's something supernatural about them. Because a human being that tall would not be mobile. I mean, the thing we notice with people that get beyond 8 feet, serious loss of mobility. They can't carry anything. And it's a principle of physics. As your height goes up, the weight of the bones to support that height goes up geometrically. And so there's a good reason why the tallest players in the NBA are the least mobile. They're having to carry that heavy body around. And so your best basketball players are not the ones that are 7.5 and 8 feet tall. And the tallest human that ever lived was 8 feet 11, and he died of physical exhaustion before he hit the age of 40. So it tells us that there's something about these Nephilim that is supernatural. One explanation is that the sons of God were fallen angels. So that would explain a supernatural connection. Another explanation is that these were demon-possessed men that came to the daughters of men that were not demon-possessed. And then the third theory is that God had commanded the sons of Seth to leave alone the daughters of Cain. Or pardon me, that's the other way around, that the sons of Cain visited the daughters of Seth. So those are the 3 theories out there. But I argue the only way you can make any of those theories work is to bring in a supernatural component, because it's simply not possible for physical human beings, limited by the laws of physics, to reach that height and still be functional in battle.
All righty. And so with that, I do want to say I very much appreciate you being here with us today. We're going to go ahead and wrap up there as we have now hit hour and 30 minutes. So I want to say thank yous, of course. And for those of you who are in our audience, please do like and share the video. Please do consider subscribing if you like this content. Hit that bell to get notified every time we go live. We do post infrequently in the sense that we don't have a set schedule, but frequently in the sense that I'm posting quite often. Before we get out of here, Dr. Ross, is there anything else you would like to say to me or the audience?
Yeah, I mean, you're probably aware that when Christians get together and talk about science and faith, especially about the age of the universe and about biological evolution, the dialogues can get quite heated. And I think we as Christians need to realize non-Christians are watching us. I mean, Jesus said, they'll know you're my disciples by your love for one another. And I think how we need to measure our love for one another is on areas where we disagree. So I just want to compliment you because you made sure this dialogue was charitable. And I think that's crucial. Whatever we disagree on as Christians, we need to disagree in a charitable, gracious, respectful spirit. Because after all, non-Christians are watching us and they pay way more attention to our demeanor than they do our words. So how we treat one another is going to decide whether or not these non-Christians are going to trust us enough to enter into a dialogue. So I just want to compliment you for making sure that what our dialogue today was a gracious one.
And I appreciate that greatly, and likewise to you as well. It was an absolutely fantastic conversation, and I appreciate you greatly for being here as well, because I know that not only am I a very small channel / apologist at the moment, but also one thing that comes with size is quite hectic schedule, right? So you've taken time out of your day to kind of take a leap of faith, so to speak with me. So I appreciate that tremendously. For all you know, this could have been me wanting to jump Hugh Ross and make myself the guardian of YEC, right? So I appreciate you taking that leap of faith and talking to me, and great conversation as well. And I also want to say on this note, because obviously we do disagree, but one thing that I will always remember, so long as the Lord has me, with a functioning mind. Probably my favorite Hugh Ross quote of all time is, we can solve this issue and then we can move on to the next church splitting issue that has absolutely nothing to do with salvation whatsoever. And I thought it was obviously spoken tongue in cheek, but I thought it was a good thing to say, in the sense that, this isn't something that splits us as not brothers, right? It's something we disagree on.
It is tongue in cheek, but you see this all throughout church history.
Mm-hmm.
Christians are always dividing over the non-essentials of the Christian faith and ignoring the things that are really important. So
yeah, absolutely, and I totally agree with that. And yeah, I love that quote. It would be malfeasant if I did not have that quote at the end of an interview with Dr. Hugh Ross. So I want to say again, I appreciate you being here, audience. I appreciate you guys here tremendously. Again, if you guys like this, please consider subscribing to this channel, hitting that bell to get notified every time we go live, and of course, hitting the like button so that we can let YouTube know that this is good content. If you guys feel led, please do consider partnering with us on Patreon to help me turn this into a career as far as apologetics is concerned. And also, if you feel led, please consider checking out reasonstobelieve.com, or is it .org?
Yeah, it's reasons.org.
.org, yes. And checking out some of Dr. Ross's books, as well as debates and YouTube videos. They're obviously not only good, but of course it's always best to get content straight from the source rather than hearing what I or somebody else has to say about it, right? So I don't have anything in the description right now, but links to all of those things will be in the descriptions below. And yeah, I want to say, again, I appreciate you very much. And to the audience, if the Lord tarries and wills, we will see you here soon.